Good evening, everyone. Hi. I just wanted to quickly welcome all of our faculty members, staff, students, and several alumni in the room tonight, which is awesome. My name is Trina Harrison, and I'm the alumni coordinator here at Augustana. I've been pleased to work on the 2019 last lecture with my co-host, Alex Ho, student delegates from the Augustana Students Association, as well as my colleagues from the Alumni Relations Office at Enterprise Square in Edmonton. The last lecture is a celebration of inspiring education at the University of Alberta. The concept became internationally recognized in 2007 with Dr. Andy Posch. The University of Alberta celebrated its version of last lecture for the first time in 2014. Because of the unique connections that our students have with their professors at Augustana, we've been hosting an Augustana-specific last lecture since 2015. We host last lecture to give students and former students an opportunity to celebrate the instructors who have made their U of A education unique and outstanding. The Alumni Impact Survey found that when asked which U of A experience had the greatest impact on them, the overwhelming response was experience with faculty. This is both a response to that finding and an opportunity to celebrate the beginning of a close to another academic year for our community. Following this evening's talk, we hope that you'll linger in the lobby to visit with classmates, faculty, staff, and alumni, and to enjoy our complimentary reception.
Unfortunately, I was never graced with the opportunity to take one of Sparky's classes, but I've heard nothing but great things, from drama students to just regular students who were needing credits. Paul Sparky Johnson is clearly the kind of professor that genuinely cares about his students and the work that they do. He brings an extraordinary level of passion and enthusiasm to his teaching, speaking, performing, and writing. And this is why it is my pleasure to ask Sparky tonight, if this were your last time to address a group of students, what would you say to them?
Start by saying this. Hit it, Peter. Bring on. Put me in, coach. I'm ready to play. Today, look at me. I could be center field. Wouldn't it be great if you could enter any room with a theme song of your life playing in the background? That's how we should live our life. And it wouldn't have to be the same theme song every day. But for me tonight, put me in, coach, that's the one. That's the one I often use in my classes. I don't even know if my students know who John Fogerty is, but I'll say, put me in, coach. That's what we want to start the class. We want that sense of readiness. We want you to be on the balls of your feet. You're that little Pinocchio, the little wooden boy on his doorstep as his father is holding him back as he's heading off to his first day of school. That sense of excitement, that sense of readiness. Put me in, coach. Well, I've said to some people that, yes, this is a last lecture, but in some ways it's my first lecture, because I don't really lecture. I do workshops. We call them lecture labs. And in that, yes, I can start lecturing once in a while. But I live by an ancient Chinese proverb, you probably know it, that a person hears and they forget, but a person sees and they remember. That's why I'm going to start out with a visual here. As you can see, and you'll remember this, this is an interior. You're saying, oh, it just looks like some regular old lounge. There's windows off on one side, and there's a leather couch and a coffee table, newspaper spread on the table, a couple of people sitting there. Well, I'll let you know, this lounge
is in Chicago, Illinois, DePaul University. And you, though, that are very observant and have good eyesight, better than mine, notice that the newspaper spread out says January 2000. That's when it happened. You'll be interested to know that that newspaper, you can't see it, but the entertainment section, the entire section, was devoted to the work of Viola Spolin and Paul Sills. Because Paul happened to be in town that day, or that week, and that's him that I'm sitting with there in the lounge. He's feeling really tired. He's done a whole week of workshops. He's old by this time, and he said, I don't know, Sparky, I know they're pissed off at me because I wouldn't let them film this thing, but I'm just afraid I'm going to say something stupid and then it'll be there for all time. And Viola was that way too. Very reticent about allowing cameras or any kind of recording into what she was doing. And Paul very much that way. But he had one more workshop to do, and so he said, I don't know what I'm going to do with them. And I suggested, well, why don't you do stage picture followed by transformation? A lot of you are nodding your heads. That's what I would have said. Well, some of the students maybe. And he said, oh, you think they can handle that? But that's what he did. That's exactly what he did. And there was a lot of pressure because all of the faculty of DePaul University, of the drama faculty anyway, were there observing, and they were using their graduate students. And the workshop went like gangbusters. And at the end, Paul said, I wish we would have taped that. So you just never know. Actually, there's a third part to that proverb you probably know. A person hears and they forget. A person sees and they remember. And the third part is a person does and they understand. That's the great thing about drama. We also do. But I think it's the idea of seeing and remembering. That's why professors use PowerPoints in lectures, don't you think? Because you get to have something up there. We've got the screen, we've got everything here. We could do a PowerPoint. I tell my students, actually, that you want to organize your presentations with 4 words. Hook, book, look, and took. Hook, book, look, and took. The hook, that's what's going to, it's like the fishing metaphor. Send the hook out, get a fish, and you reel them in. Something that's exciting. I want to hear more about this. Then the book, that's the meat and potatoes of the whole thing. Look, this is taking a look around, observation, commentary, interpretation, and took, application. How does this apply to my life? What do I take away from this? So, with that in mind, you're probably thinking, well, I wonder what the hook was in this presentation. You'd probably be arguing about it for decades, actually. Was it the Put Me In Coach song, or was it that crazy gag with the slide that he had? And that is a gag. In fact, I put that gag in specifically because that's when I used to use 33 years ago. Yeah, some of the students are nodding. That's when people knew what these things were. There's probably some in the audience now that are going, what is that little cardboard thing he's holding up? And you know, when they first brought in PowerPoint and stuff like that, they talked about, put this slide on. And I was, how do I get my Kodachrome slide into my computer? It didn't make sense to me. But of course, now we talk slides and we talk about visuals. But the big thing was, I remember Jonathan Moore a few weeks ago asked me, well, do you know what you're going to talk about? And I said, the hard thing is trying to figure out what not to talk about. I wanted to bring up a visual, speaking of slides, of just 1 billion words in the smallest font possible. And I don't know what the smallest font possible is. I've got as small as 1, but I'm going to try going 0.800 or something like that and see if it's small enough that I can't even see it anymore. But anyway, put up all these words inside someone's head and then some way of trying to get them to come out. The closest visual I could find to that was this, which you can see, it's called Cacophony of Sounds. by John Minion. And it deals with music. And it's just a whole lot of, there are some words in there, but it's a whole, and eventually it forms into a, what is that called, that measure, the staff of a treble clef, or I don't know. Anyway, if you can imagine what I wanted was all these words, and I have all these thoughts in my head, and inside my head it's absolutely brilliant. The problem is I have to translate all those thoughts into this thing called words or language. And that, I think like Sills, sometimes I feel I'm not so good at. And when I start saying it, it comes out, you think, oh, that's not so great. But anyway, hopefully, as I try and translate these thoughts, if I were to use gibberish, it would be a lot more brilliant. But then again, maybe you wouldn't get much out of it. But speaking of visuals, I do recycle. And a few years back, I did a presentation on the theme for the year, which was on play. Jane Yardley presented, and then I presented. I had put together a bunch of slides that dealt with play, and I thought, why not use them again? Because I'm talking about play. And what's going to happen here, I'm going to talk about the four people you see on the outside of the circle, but primarily I'm going to talk about Paul Sills. Before I get to that, I want to begin by saying a huge thank you. This is a real honor for me to be up here. It's a real honor to see all of you come here. I want to thank Trina and Alex, the ASA, and the Alumni Association for putting this whole thing on. I want to thank all the friends and community members from here and beyond. All my colleagues, present and former colleagues that have come out, and especially those I've worked with closely in drama, like Kevin. I don't know if Christine is here. She gave the last lecture. And I know she would have wanted to be here. She wrote to me about it. I also want to thank my family, my partner Kathy. I guess I should have put this at the end. Anyway, my son Kai is not here. My daughter Heidi, here with her partner Brandon. I even have a sibling here. And this is my sister Mary. She's my oldest sister. She remembers everything about Borneo, which I don't, because I was just born there and left as a toddler. But all the things the stories I've told you guys about Stinky Mop, she can verify those. She has a better memory because she was older. Always older. She's still older. And anyway, I do want to thank all of my students, past and present, for coming out. It's a real honor for me. Thank you. I do want to, as I said, I want to talk about Paul Sills primarily, but I will touch on these other three. If we were to follow it in a pattern, we'll start with Neva, we'll move to Viola. Normally we move to Paul and then over to Jill Bolt-Taylor, who really has nothing to do with those other three, but she does, and you'll find out why. But I'm going to go Neva, Viola, then straight down to Jill Bolt-Taylor, and do it as quickly as I can so that we have as much time to spend with Paul as possible. So Neva, see that? You look at that picture, you could say circa what? I mean, even though you look at her face, she's still a relatively young woman in that picture. But have you ever noticed when you walk into high schools, like the comp here, as you start going back through the years, you get to the years where your parents were high school age, and those people are still 17, 18 years old, and they look like your parents. They were old already when they were in high school. And you go back even farther than that. And yeah, maybe it has something to do with hairstyle and the clothes they're wearing, but it's more there than that. I think it's just they lived at a different time. They knew different things, so they looked different. The things I want to point out about Neva, and maybe I'll refer to my notes here, is that she was involved with Hull House in Chicago. Jane Addams is fairly famous. It was a settlement house for immigrant, primarily children, but people living in immigrant communities new to the United States. And Neva was a recreation director who was also a sociologist. She wrote tons. And you can see all the things she wrote. She traveled the world and picked up games and folk dances from around the world. And Neva believed that if the entire world would just get together and play games and do folk dances, we wouldn't have problems. You wouldn't have to have political forums next door because we'd all get along. And I think she's right. It's just really hard to execute. And you can see some of the books. The only book that I know of that's still in print of all those is the one called Handbook of Recreational Games, which actually lists, I think, 1975, which means they made a new edition of it. Some of the older books I have copies of. This one cost $1.25, and it's the folk games of Denmark and Sweden. One of my favorites, and it only costs $1, is hospital and bedside games. You have to, when you're on a bedside and you're confined to a bed or in a hospital, you still need to play games. It's interesting that some of the games in here involve knives. As does her Handbook of Recreational Games, because there was a time, and actually when I was a kid going to school, we carried pocket knives. And you'd whip out the knife, you'd open it up, and you'd play games where you'd stick it into the ground and you'd have to move your foot. Nobody thought, what's the safety concern here? But I noticed she has the one in the hospital where you still got a knife and it has to have two blades. So you open the one part way and then the other one fully, and then you're throwing it at some kind of target, maybe the bed. And then depending on how it sticks in, you see how many fingers you can get between the blade and the heft of the knife. And if it's 3 fingers, you go to third base. If it's 2 fingers, you go to second base. Well, you get the game. Anyway, that's it's a different time. But that's what, and the interesting thing about Neva is that Viola Spolin studied with Neva Boyd. And as Paul would tell me, Viola would say, I played all the games. And that's significant in that as we work with Viola, what made Viola special was, yes, she played the games, but then she was doing classes on theater. And any time that she found there was a problem in theater, she would think of a game to solve that problem. And her original book, Improvisation for the Theater, included over 200 games. It's been updated now. The latest edition came out in 2000. The third edition, and there's even more games because she kept developing games throughout her career. Take note of that quote. I won't read it, but it'll come back later in things that Paul says. Her vision was of a world of accessible intuition. For Viola, she called it focus. In the original edition of the book, she called it point of concentration, because she knew it wasn't concentration. We can say you focus on the ball in baseball or something like that. But if you were just concentrating on the ball or the puck, Gus, take note, then of course you can't play the game because you're just staring at where this thing is going. So she knew it wasn't concentration, so she called it point of concentration and later focus, which meant you take in the whole picture, the entire picture, which I even maintain and must include the crowd. It certainly does in theater. And that's what she called focus. And Paul used to tell us this story when he'd say, anybody can hit a ball with a bat. But there's one difference between the person, any one of us hitting a ball with a bat, and the person who earns millions of dollars hitting a ball with a bat. And that one word is focus. Focus. And you'll hear athletes talk about, I was in the zone. They're talking about focus. And so Viola was very much into focus, and she knew that by focus, you could access the intuition. It's a balance between the rational mind and the intuition, and that's what Viola was after. Now I want to quickly, yes, I'm changing mind to body. This is one of Viola's sayings that Paul collected and put in the book. And he told me this. We were in his house in Wisconsin, and he said, one day Viola called me and she said, I'm changing mind to body. I'm on the phone. What? Anywhere in the book where I say mind, I'm changing the word to body. And that's what she came to, that we could arrive at focus through that integration of mind and body. And that's what we work toward. Paul knew when someone was on focus. He would say, I can tell when someone's on focus because suddenly the pencil, if they're writing, suddenly the pencil has substance, or the fork has space, which the game he was probably talking about was conversation with involvement. It's a tough game. We usually play it fairly early on just to show that there's more to this than just pretend. Students are given the task of, you need to eat a meal while carrying on a conversation. You have to do both, and you're constantly side coached. Keep talking, keep eating. Keep talking, keep talking. No, keep eating. And Paul would side coach, chew it, taste it, keep talking. If you don't taste it, and if you don't swallow, it was never there. And a lot of times people go, well, I can talk and eat at the same time, that's no problem. And you go, well, was the food really there? I don't think so. So, a lot of people, as I say, resort to pretend eating. But a baby must learn to negotiate the food from their bowl to their mouth. Because in the beginning, that's exactly what they do, even with their hands. They're missing their mouth. Finally, they get it, and they do it enough times that pretty soon it becomes standard. And then they can do it in what Viola would call no motion. They don't think about it, they don't not think about it. It works. And likewise, when we eat a meal, unless it's salad, we can pretty much eat without thinking. We get the stuff to our mouth. And although people have been trained, well, you don't talk while you're eating, but if you're really into your company, you will talk. You will talk while you're eating. And you'll swallow. If you don't swallow, you're going to end up with a lot of food spraying out of your mouth. So we do it in no motion. It's just like the little toddler who's learning how to walk. Does she walk yet? If you hold her. So there was a time in all of our lives where we were at that state, where we had to think about walking. We had to get the balance, but eventually we do it over and over and over again. Now we walk in no motion, meaning we don't think about it. We don't not think about it. All right, Jill Bolt-Taylor, a neurosurgeon, so she knows about brains. The reason why I bring her up is because what happened to Jill kind of proves what Viola was talking about this whole time. She had a stroke at the age of 37, an aneurysm in her left brain. She had just been working out, she was taking a shower, and she thought, something's funny, getting this tingly feeling. And then her mind started going funny, and she had done enough brain research that she knew something strange was going on. She said, all I wanted to do was just lay down on my bed, and this was nirvana, because her intuition had been able to finally, after being quashed for all those years, was finally able to come out. And the intuition is the present tense. I'm here, right now. I'm present. This is where it's at. I'll stay here. Didn't Goethe's Faust, that's what he was after, right? If I could ever say to the fleeting moment, stay, then the devil could have my soul. So he's always looking for that present moment that he can say, stay. I wanted to just say briefly that what happened to Jill was she lost the things that the intellect provide for you. She knew enough that she needed to phone and get help. She went to her desk and she had a stack of business cards, and she was able to be cognizant enough that every once in a while she pulled one, no, that's not it. She found the one that belonged for her work. And then she was able to compare the squiggly symbols on that card to the squiggly symbols on the keypad of her phone. And by covering up the ones she had already done, it took her 45 minutes, but she finally called her office. And when the phone rang and someone answered, all she heard was, and she thought, what? Why are they talking like that? But, I mean, she knew she had this emergency, so in her mind she's thinking, this is Jill, I'm having a medical emergency, please send help. And she said that into the phone, but what came out was, and on the other end, they didn't know what she was saying, but they knew it was her number by call display, and they knew enough that they'd better send help, and it saved her life. In the book, you'll see there's a big picture where they had to break her skull open and operate on her brain. Anyway, I could go on. You should read the book sometime. I still good insight. But it shows that, yeah, there's things in the intellect, and labels are one of those things. And I have my own experience with that because my father had a stroke. And after he got out of the hospital, several weeks, maybe months, I can't remember, when my mom finally dialed me up and she said, I'm putting your father on the line. And I said, hi, Dad. And he said, hello. I know who you are, I just can't remember how to say your name. And I said, Paul. And he said, call. And I said, Paul. And he finally got it, Paul. But I thought that was interesting because here's the person who helped name me couldn't remember that label. And so when the labels are gone, the intuition has a chance to get more put into the forefront. And Viola would say, see the world unlabeled if you can. All right. Oh, I know what's happening now. How am I doing for time?
You're fine.
No, I better keep going. I was going to play a game here because Viola says, when it bogs down, play a game. And I thought, well, that I would be hypocritical if I didn't play a game. But I'm worried that if I do take that time right now, I'll describe a couple of games to you as we get, and I guess I've done that already. But let me talk about Paul here. As he says, it is on intuition, by the way, that Viola is the expert. And actually, I give credit to Kathy here because she's the one that said, why don't you just tell some stories about Paul? He enrolled at the University of Chicago. If you want to know more about Chicago, Becky and Alan, they're alums from there, and they'll tell you all about it. I think they came later than Paul. The time that Paul came, Robert Hutchins was the chancellor, and he believed in a very progressive education. Students didn't have to take regular classes. Well, the way Paul described it to me was, you'd walk in, they'd sit you down in some big room, and all the faculty are behind some gigantic big table. And you spend all this time, they ask you all these questions to find out everything you don't know. And then they prescribe some courses and some books that you need to read so that by the end of 4 years, you know everything. And he laughed. But there is something to Hutchins' plan, and you probably could talk to Alan and Becky in more detail about that. They wanted you to learn how to think, and by learning how to think, that would enable one to learn how to do. What's interesting about the University of Chicago at that time was there was no theater program. And Paul had studied theater with his mom his entire life. That doesn't mean that students didn't do theater. I don't know where they found a theater. They had a theater. Ed Asner would sleep up in the balcony. He didn't have a place to live. But all these people came, and Paul did some acting, but eventually he became their director. And all those people, if you were to look back, many of them became basically a who's who of theater, television, and film for decades to come. some argue that, well, maybe Paul wasn't such a great director, he just had such amazing people to work with. But I argue the other way. Paul, by using his mother's games and bringing about presence and intuition, was able to bring out the best in those people. And Paul always believed that right till his last days. He wanted to work with regular people. I don't want to work with actors. And he would do things with the community people that lived around where he lived. And he would bring the best out of them. By saying that you only work with the best people is what will get you the best product, that's like saying, and this is a joke I put in here, it's like saying it's only because the Oilers have had 4 first overall picks, including Connor McDavid, that makes them such a great hockey team. Well, pretty funny. Anyway, his ability to guide anyone to that state of focus is, I believe, what made Paul the genius that he is. Now, I've got a little bit of an audio clip. As I mentioned, Paul, he didn't want them to film him, and that was true through his entire life. And so when I went down there on some U of A money, actually, I got the chance to go down to California in April of 2015 and interview Paul and his wife Carol at Viola's home in the Hollywood Hills. I didn't know if he would allow me to take our conversations. I knew we'd have conversations, but he agreed. And over the course of 2 days, there's probably about 3 hours of conversation, and most of it is just us hemming and hawing and stuff. But I did take. No one's heard these tapes, but I thought for a last lecture, since you came, you should get a chance to hear this. So what you're going to hear is, first of all, I took about 10 minutes of it and I edited it down to 3 minutes. So you'll hear, first of all, they're talking about Sheldon Patinkin, who was a former director of the Second City, who went on to teaching. I chose this little segment because it pretty much mirrors my life. I came out of the professional theater and came here to teach in 1986. I didn't even have my master's yet. But I didn't know how to teach. And that's what they talk about Sheldon here. Then Paul just says a brief little bit about, listen, there's more in the book than even I know. And then I ask him a question about story theater, and you'll hear we get onto one of his quotations.
That when Sheldon started to work at Columbia College, he went to Viola's home.
Well, then he converted himself to teaching. He didn't know how to teach him, so he used Viola's theater games, which saved his ass.
Yeah.
And since then, he's been a disciple of Viola.
Oh, for sure.
More in it than I ever got.
Oh, music.
I get a certain amount of it because she's my mother.
When the work you were doing evolved into story theater, is there any particular Spolin games that you think kind of pushed you that way, or?
Yeah, it's the whole mass of it.
Viola, there's a sentence.
You can hear how both Paul and Carol
came up
struggle with labels at this point in their lives.
Conversation between you and Viola.
And she's remembering this saying,
which,
and she's not
the
getting it quite
conversation
right.
resulted in a sentence, which was, when you can overcome character, emotion, and story, theater can begin.
Something like
that.
It wasn't
not quite.
overcome.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It was,
You-
but the
I knew the
problems-
quote.
That's
but,
printed in the book somewhere.
You'll hear it.
Is it
in one
among
of
the
the
sayings? I don't know.
When you're no
Actually-
longer trapped by
Oh, the trap.
Yeah.
Overcome the trap.
The trap
Of
of
character, story, and emotion. Those
Yeah.
are the three things we talked about.
Something
Which of course you must have, character,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
story,
yeah.
and emotion, but they are.
After that, those conversations, right after that is when your theater emerged. Because I think that's what you were trying to do, to overcome all of, you wanted a theater.
Well, we got past,
Yeah,
I mean, you
and
know,
that,
Second
and it's a
City.
story theater.
they got past somebody sitting there trying to think of what to say.
Well, it was a review form, and so everything was a short piece.
But
and they
the
were-
really talented people are past it.
Yeah,
And they don't just stop and think about the next thing. It's just there for them. It's in the process of the play that it all works out. I don't know anything and I forget everything. So therefore, really, I'm not anything clear about this. But if I start, I'll get there.
Yeah. If I start, I'll get there. And that was the thing about Paul's genius. I had the privilege of coaching a lot of the games after he had his stroke, where he would sit there in the workshop and we would have talked ahead of time and said, we're going to play this game. So then I would say the game and he'd go, what is that? And I would describe the game and how it's played. And then of course, as he heard it or as he saw people doing it, he would know exactly what the game was and what the purpose of the game was, what the focus was. I'm glad on the tape that he said, of course you have to have character, story, and emotion, but if they become the focus, if all you're thinking is, well, I'll play with a hunchback, or I'll do my character with this accent, then you're focused on character and then you're trapped. You can't be in the present, you can't be making those constant discoveries, the unfolding of the unknown. Now I've got my sayings of Paul Sills, some of the things that he said, and this is the look portion of the talk, where we interpret it a little bit. It's a little bit like Luther's small catechism. What does this mean? We are to fear and love improvisation, so that when you are in a state of reflection, you are including another. Actually, that's Paul still talking about Viola, saying this sounds like Viola. But you probably heard the improvisation term yes and. Anyone heard that term? Yes and. And all kinds of groups use it now. It came out of the Second City, Del Close specifically as a director. The problem with yes and is that, I mean, it's great. You never deny, you're always building on, but it's only adding information. Viola had the idea of follow the follower, which is all about reflection. And what I like about this quote is that when you are in a state of reflection, you are including another, but when you initiate, you deny yourself. So I would include, when you're in a state of reflection, you're also reflecting yourself, your true self. Because when you initiate, you're denying that. We're going to go through these fairly quickly now. Games and story bring out self rather than ego. This is actually just leading me to what Paul did about story theater. It's where Paul made his mark. They took story theater, it started in the 1968 riots in Chicago. The old Second City became for some reason the police didn't chase the crowds into that sanctuary. It was like it was a church. And they put on story theater and they developed these stories, this form that Paul was working with. One of them was the blue light from Grimm's fairy tales. And when they finished that story, the crowd stood up. It was speaking their stories. He took that then to Yale, they worked on it further. Eventually it went to Broadway and had a great success there. I'm not going to read all of these. I mean, it's brilliant. But Paul, again, he wrote down his interview here. I'm going to read this part. That it's only through doing that one can discover their inner self. And this is difficult stuff intellectually. It is in the joy of story. Cinderella is not allowed to go to the dance. Simpleton cannot be permitted to go into the forest to chop wood. But these most miserable creatures do overcome. They do the impossible thing, as all heroes do. With help of the helpers, they become whole, unified persons who live purposefully in the world and can expect marriage and half the kingdom. This is real teaching in my mind. So here's my sayings of Paul here. There is no technique, you just need a little respect for the invisible. A story I could tell you is that we were playing a game called What's Beyond, and I won't explain the game here, just to say that it was going really well. And when something's going really well in one of Paul's workshops, I mean, you're feeling good. He's not standing up and screaming at you. In fact, he's sitting there and going, and he's smiling. And it went way over time. And so by the end, we were all anxious to hear what Paul had to say. And he stood up and he said, "Well, I'll never play that game with you again." What? Because now you think you know how to play it. And he was right. As soon as you think you know how to play it, then it becomes technique. That's how I'm always going to play it. And that's deadly. That's a trap. So you need the respect for the invisible, the unknown. Put the focus in no motion. I already talked about no motion. It's not thinking about it, not thinking about it. So how do you put the focus in no motion? If you're a ball player, of course you practice your drills over and over again so that when you play the game, you can be in no motion. You don't have to think, how do I handle the pass? How do I shoot a slap shot? Likewise in theater, you put the focus in no motion. This was a game, the one I'm thinking of is that we were playing a game called the Emerging Where. In this game, you go out there, you choose a who, what, and a where, and the where is undefined at this point. You say, okay, let's say it's an old saloon. And then one at a time, those of you in it, you know it's an old saloon, you'll go in and you'll discover something in the where. The others are watching you. And then the next one goes in. So you end up going in 3 or 4 times. So eventually you have 9, 12 kinds of objects in that where. Then Paul will say, okay, now play the scene. So then you bring in your relationship and what you're doing there, and you play the scene. But the group that had gone before us, he was screaming at them like, "You're just going around and you're just touching everything. That's not the game. You're just touching everything." And so like, we're going on, and I'm going, "Oh, all right." And he said, "Put the focus in no motion. Don't think about it. Don't not think about it." So we went out and played, and we played this whole scene, and I remember the sawdust on the floor. It was in a ghost town, and anyway, at the end, Paul says, "Okay, well that's fine." And I thought, oh no. And he asked the group, did they solve the problem? Which was, did they make contact with all the objects that had been defined and any others that were discovered in the plane? And I said, oh no, I forgot to go and touch all the objects. And then I started to think it through, and I realized, wait a minute, I did touch everything. So that was an example of, because he had put that right in my head at that moment, put the focus in no motion, I was able to do it. Whether I could do it again, I don't know. If it's not funny, it's not working. But don't try to be funny! He would yell that right into your face. And people would go, well, he's contradicting himself. He's a madman. He's not contradicting himself. He's right. The reason why we get laughter is because people identify. You've hit on a nerve. You've hit the universal. And the only way you're going to get that is not by being clever and coming up with clever jokes. It's by telling the truth and living the truth. And that's why you say, but you don't try to be funny. Go for the truth. And people will connect and people will laugh. There's one more. Oh, no, this is one of my sayings of unpublished. And so don't publish it. On one of my sabbaticals, I was given the task of working with some, Viola had made tapes of 3 years worth of workshops, 78, 79, and 80. And these were transcribed onto thin little, almost like toilet paper, really. They were falling apart. And my job was to try and take those workshops and those transcriptions and preserve them. And in doing so, I was able to read all of Viola's side coaching. I remember when Paul handed me the first page, we were in Viola's house, and he said, read this. I read it. He said, what did you think? I said, it's already made me a better teacher. And at the same time, Paul was working on letters between Viola and himself. He said, yeah, we talked a lot about this work, so I think it'd be a good thing to publish. Then I'd go away for a week and work on my stuff, then I'd come back and I'd ask, well, how's your assignment going? And he'd go, nah. All we ever talked about was money. Where are we gonna get the money? Anyway, one of the workshops, and it was a workshop for teachers, believe it or not, Viola got very angry and she just said, listen, a child is born into this world and knows everything. And then they go to school. And she was really criticizing our school system because it focuses on the intellect, on the rational mind, and it ignores, it subjugates the intuition, the creative side, and those are all the things that we value in life come out of that. And so a lot of times, by the time people reach your guys' age, it's hard to access that intuition because it's been so used to having the rational mind be the boss. And I'll say to students in class, just tell your rational mind, you're not the boss of me in this class. But it's not easy. So finally, the took, the application. Callback. I did have another slide, and you think I'm showing you the same one? This is authentic. I can't find it. It's in here somewhere. I put it in this pocket for that very purpose. Anyway, what you'll see here, this is an outdoor scene. It's the sun, it's at that point in the sky, almost dusk, where that golden hue, you can see it on that field of rye. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah? It's just the rye looks golden. And in that rye, you see all these children playing. And if you look off to the left, there's a huge chasm, a cliff, a dangerous cliff. And there's a guy standing there. And he's trying to stop the children from falling off. You know what I'm talking about? J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. The character was named Holden Caulfield. And that was his job. As Holden said, that's all I would do all day. I would just be the catcher in the rye and all. He didn't want these children to fall off the cliff, so he stood there. Well, as a last lecture, I did want to say that we put on the poster that I called this The Power of Play. But now that I've put it all together, I decided it should be called Playful Tangents. Because one thing that has been consistent for 33 years of student evaluations is Sparky likes to get off on tangents. I don't think there's been a single student evaluation from a single class, and Keith's nodding his head. Because he had to read a lot of them, and I know at one time he said to me, well, what are you going to do about that? And I said, nothing. Because I don't head into a class thinking, I'm going to talk about this and I'm going to talk about this. It always comes out of whatever's happening at that moment, at that time. And maybe I'm not as articulate as I could be, and so they tend to drag on sometimes. But that has bonded 33 years of students. Also for 33 years, students have been reporting to me that, you know, we get kind of ridiculed from some of our peers. They'll say, what do you do in that class? Just play? Fun? What does fun have anything to do with a serious liberal arts education? Well, let me ask you, where's Martin here? Michelle, you guys told me that, didn't you? 33 years ago? I know Sammy told me that as recently as last year. My fellow science students, they think, what good is drama? Anyway, since the last lecture, I get a chance to be a little pointed here. And I'm remembering an instance years ago when I had a troop of students. We went up, maybe Lowell was in that group, and we went to Daysland for some kind of banquet, and I remember doing a gibberish translation game, and I thought it went really well, but then some guy called me over, and I thought he was going to say, good job. But he called me over, and loud enough so that his entire table and a few others could hear, I'm really glad that I didn't spend thousands of dollars so that my kid could learn gibberish. was really proud of himself. But that, unfortunately, is the attitude of many in the society in which we were raised and we now live. So I want to say shame on any teachers and preachers or ancestral family members who instilled these attitudes in us. Shame on us if we continue to perpetuate these biases and we partner in pushing the children over the cliff. Holden Caulfield shouldn't be the catcher in the rye, because he can never keep up. Rather, he should be the gatherer in the rye. And what all of us Holdens need to do is gather everyone into a circle in the middle of that crazy field of rye and play a game. We may not know anything, and we may forget everything, but if we start, we'll get there. Thank you very much.
Before we end the evening, does anybody have any questions for Sparky?
Yeah, I would gladly take any questions. In fact, I was looking forward to the questions because I think I'm more spontaneous answering a question than I am trying to deliver a structured speech. Gary Schneidmiller.
I'm going to ask you a difficult question.
Yes, please.
What's the most interesting moment you've had in your time at Augustana?
Gary's asking, what is the most interesting moment I've had in my time at Augustana? Wow. What do you think, Gary? Wow. Well, you know what? I would probably go back to 1993 when we moved that building. Because, and Leroy is here, I know, and he had a lot to do with that. Anyway, it was going to be torn down, and we bought it for $1. But we went into huge debt because it cost several $100,000 to move it and put it on this site here. But it gave us, as a drama department, a place to call home.
And it gave the art department a place to call home.
That's right. Prior to that, we were in the auxiliary building. And so they were able to take over that space and use it well, actually. Yeah. Thanks, Gary. Any other questions?
Is there a particular play that stands out in your mind that you've done over these years? That one particular one?
Well, Trevor is asking, is there a particular play that stands out in my mind over the years? It's interesting. And I'm listening to those interviews with Paul and Carol. It's one thing that I reminded him that he had said to me, and he didn't remember saying it, but it's always stood with me. And I think that's where I'm at, is that whatever I'm doing right now, it's the best work I've ever done. And I think it has to be. Because if I'm living in the past, then what's this one for? So anyway, sorry. Thanks, Carol.
I remember the Conference of the Birds. That was mine.
Oh yeah, okay, that's an interesting one, yeah. Conference of the Birds. Martin?
Well, this has always been a conflict with me. So I love that quote from Viola about being in a state of reflection, and to initiate is to deny yourself. So, but like any rock that has to move down a hill, somebody has to initiate, something has to happen. So when you're dealing with, your theater games or whatever, how do you not initiate? Does that make sense?
Yeah, Martin's asking a question that all of us ask. You sometimes have to initiate, and maybe you do. But the one I would point out is Viola's game that kind of encapsulates this whole concept of follow the follower, and it's her mirror game. A lot of people play the mirror and they think it's just about being exact as you can, but she gets the mirror to the point where you're not following, no one's initiating, you're simply following. And when you're side coaching that game, you're always side coaching. See the whole body, head to toe focus. Knees reflect knees. Upper lip reflects upper lip. And if you're with another person, and I'm the only Paul Sparky Johnson ever in the world at this point in time, or ever really. And if I'm with you and we're doing that, I'm seeing something I've never seen before. And my cheekbones are reflecting Martin's cheekbones. And I've got to always heighten my reflection so something is always moving. It can never be in a state of stasis. So in that regard, yeah, sometimes you have to kick it into motion, but if you're really good at it, I think you can just go. Because there's always something. No fear of the unknown, and the unknown is always there for us. Any other questions? Oh, Sarah.
How did you get your nickname?
How did I get my nickname? Long story short, the Actors Union, what we call equity in the U.S. and Britain and in Canada, it's just called Canadian Actors Equity. When you join that as a professional actor, no one can have the same name. As much as I'm an individual, I have to have an individual moniker. And so Johnson is such a common last name that when I was joining the union, I thought people were calling me Sparky, so maybe I'm not even answering your question. But I just decided then that I would go by Sparky Johnson because at least it would give me a little bit of a differentiation. It turned out that there wasn't another Paul Johnson at that time. I could have taken that name. Speaking of names, I remember my mother saying, "We gave you a good name." But that's kind of how it stuck. And then I came here actually and I thought, well, now I've got a serious job. I won't go by Sparky anymore, but that didn't last long. So anyway, I hope that answers. Dale?
Is there anything, what you might have taught in the first years, is there anything that later on you thought, oh, I should never have taught it that way, I wish I had taught it this way, or what changed, something changed from beginning to end?
It's always changing. Yeah, I'm sure if I went back to that long ago, I would cringe. It's all cringe-worthy. Yesterday was cringe-worthy. Tomorrow's going to be better. And hopefully right now is really good. But yeah, no, it's constantly changing. I think it always has to be. In fact, they call Viola's book, Improvisation for the Theater, the Bible of improvisation. And I think that's a good name for it. Because a lot of people take it like people take the Bible, where if it says this, then that's it. And they'll take that literal translation, and they'll do that with Viola's side coaching. But what I noticed when I had all of her transcripts was her side coaching only was contingent upon what was happening in that moment at that time, and not anything to do with what she had written in the book. And I remember a student at one time saying, and this again isn't published, but a student said, "But Viola, in the book you said," and then she said, "Forget what I said in the book, I wish I'd never written the damn thing. That was then and this is now." And so yeah, I think education constantly has to be changing that way based on what's happening, who you're with. The world is different every single day we wake up. That's why a scripted play involves improvisation. You're maybe saying the same lines again, but you can't ever say them the same way twice. Because you're different, the world is different, the audience is different. And that's improvisation. One more question, Sam.
What are your thoughts on living every moment as kind of like an improvisation?
It's rude. Oh.
If we always improv every moment, just live completely in the present, should we ever prepare?
You all heard Sam. So if you're always living every moment, should you ever prepare? Well, I think it kind of dovetails off of what I just said about the scripted play. And what I would say to teachers is that we have to improvise all the time, but we have to improvise within a structure. And so you provide yourself a structure, and then within that structure, yeah, you can play the moment. But to live in the moment every single minute, that's hard. Viola even wrote a poem, finding the present is really hard to do. And what Paul said, I went through rather quickly, but he talked about the Greek myth. The series is looking for her daughter, and she's carrying two lanterns, one for the intellect, one for the intuition. We need both. He would constantly say, "Coach, get out of your head," which many would say, well, okay, I'm not supposed to think at all. But you do have to think. You need both. A child is born into this world with a balance of intuition and intellect, and then they go to school, and that quashes the intuition. But if we can get ourselves back into balance where our present self and our creative self is in tune with our intellectual self, and we write things down, write stories. You need the intellect for that. So yeah. Anyway, great question. That's the last one. Thanks,